Okay, so like we said, anarchism is really hard to pin down because they're also individualistic. They're all such individuals. So um, we find they're a little bit like herding cats. So what are the main tensions and debates and key thinkers for? So let's start, as we always do, with what they agree on. So as you can see from the right, all anarchists are radicals. So what that means is they're really critical of the existing order. They don't want to tweak it. They don't want to change it. They want to really smash it. They all reject the state. They all want power to be decentralized to as low a level as possible, really, including the level of the individual. If you centralize power, then you start to have authority, you start to have a government, and that's what they're against. In line with this, the decisions are made directly. So individuals, even if you're a collectivist anarchist, individuals contribute to the decision-making process. Think of it like direct democracy, really. There is liberty and economic freedom, and there is an optimistic view of human nature. Now, I think some of maybe the most fundamental ones here are an optimistic view of human nature. So human nature is malleable and tends to be positives, malleable being changeable, and they reject all state and authority. So they don't like state intervention, they don't like authority. Okay, so what are the two main types? Well, I think you've seen this slide before. You have collectivist anarchists. These guys argue for a stateless society where common ownership will foster altruistic and cooperative sides of human nature. So all cooperative anarchists believe that if humans work together, that will bring out the best side of us. In this version of anarchism, there can be no private property as we see it. That's not strictly true. As you see, the mutualists don't mind a little bit of private property, but for most collectivists, producers get to control what happens to their product. Now, they do differ on whether the individual can keep it or whether the group controls it, etc., etc. On this side, on the collectivist side, they tend to advocate revolution. That's not always violent revolution, but it is revolution of some sort. And think of this almost like extreme socialism, but with more freedom. So you have equality for collectivist anarchists. That's very important to all of them. They're very against private property, or at least large-scale private property, but they want to continue to have freedom as well. Almost like they want to have their cake and eat it, but we'll see, that's up to you. Individualist anarchists, so these guys are split into two, really, but we'll see those later. But generally, these guys argue for a stateless society, however, without an end to private property necessarily. In their view, human beings should be completely free in the economic sphere too. People will associate voluntarily, and disputes will be resolved by reason. So again, you can see that that positive view of human nature coming up there, that humans are rational and reasonable, etc. You can think of these guys like extreme classical liberals or classical liberalism, but without the night watchman state. So even more free, as if you want, because you haven't even got that night watchman state. Okay, so what are the groups made up of? The collective anarchists are the anarcho-communists. They're probably the most collectivist, if you want. The anarcho-syndicalists and the mutualists. The mutualists are a little bit of a sort of bridge between the two, as we're going to see, but I'll put them in the collectivists for the time being. Individualist anarchists are egoists, and the anarcho-capitalists or capitalism. Okay, so a little bit of a spoiler here. So Max Stirner is a little bit of an outlier, so just be careful. He's an individualist, but he kind of said bad things about capitalism. He wasn't totally clear, but he said that capitalism produces meaningless work and things like that. Okay. The main disagreements between these two types of anarchists are that, well, collectivist anarchists really criticise the individualists because they believe that actually problems can't be solved by individuals, or just individuals alone, or by the hand of the market. They believe that humans have to work in groups. They also agree that education and building alternatives are an important part of change, but think that kind of revolution is necessary to overthrow authority. Individualist anarchists criticise collectivists because they fear that individuality and autonomy will be threatened by collectivism. So they put the individual above everything, and they think that as soon as you get into a group, you start to crush the individual. If everything is commonly owned, individual freedom is lost. And that's especially true for the anarcho-capitalists. And tensions over strategies for replacing the state. They believe that revolution involves theft and is therefore wrong. Particularly, again, the anarcho-capitalists believe that. They believe that private property is an extension of the individual and shouldn't be messed with. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to go through some of the strains and some of the thinkers. So, anarcho-communism is probably the furthest left on the spectrum of anarchists, I suppose. This is they believe that full communism is the best way to realise liberty. So they have a very similar view of liberty to socialists, in that equality is necessary for humans to be truly free. Closest to the views of Kropotkin, who believe that species who survive cooperate, and we've got a nice picture of some ants all cooperating together and ensuring their survival. They believe that private property is theft, and production and the fruits of labour should be collective. I mean, they believe this is done voluntarily, but they believe in collectivism very strongly. And you've got that phrase there, from each according to their ability, to each according to need. So if you can see that, it shows that human kind of endeavour is aimed towards the goals of the group, as it were, rather than the goals of the individual. And Kropotkin sort of imagined a commune, I think, in which small groups use direct democracy to keep autonomy, and all association was voluntary, whether it was with other communes or nationally or internationally. So that's them. So think, socialism, really. Socialism with a bit of freedom. So the main thinkers here are Mikhail Bakunin. So he was a bit of a character. He's a Russian-born aristocrat, or I don't know. He's from quite a well-to-do family, but turned revolutionary. He didn't actually write many books, so I haven't got a book to give you here, because he spent most of his time either trying to start revolutions or being in jail for starting revolutions. So, but he's regarded really as the founder of collectivist anarchism. So he believed that human nature is social, and so production in society should be collectivist because it enhances our human nature. So he thought that was the best fit for us. He believed revolution should not capture the state, but be through propaganda by the deed, such as non-payment of taxes, strikes, refusing the draft, which means refusing to cooperate in armies. So how are we going to use Mikhail Bakunin? Well, he was the founder of collectivists, so he's definitely worth a mention for any collectivist anarchist point. He's a major thinker for anarcho-communism. He was actually a contemporary of Marx, and they had a very public disagreement. So they were kind of enemies, and Bakunin cussed Marx out, and he said, you will, if you have equality without freedom, you will have the worst tyranny the world has ever seen, which turned out to be fairly true in terms of what we saw in some parts of Russian and Chinese history. But so he argued that equality without liberty would lead to oppression, and Marx had a big argument with him and got him chucked out of this international group, so he was kind of exiled again, even though he turned out to be right. Propaganda by the deed. How else can we use him? Well, propaganda by the deed is the kind of hallmark of modern anarchist tactics. People still do it. So you think of the Occupy movement, you can think of Extinction Rebellion protests. People still use this kind of the same kind of tactics that were outlined by Mikhail Bakunin. So he's good for collectivism and as a path to a new society. So it's a really good thinker for anarcho-communism and collectivists generally. I think he probably should get a mention in most essays. Okay, the next one for anarcho-communism is Peter Kropotkin. He literally looks like Santa, doesn't he? Look at him. Oh. But to authorities, he was a very dangerous man. So he in his book Mutual Aid, he argues that mutual aid is the way forward. So species, and therefore societies in which individuals help each other, are the ones that survive and thrive. So you could think of the example could be the Black Panther Food and Survival Program in the 1970s, 60s, 70s, in which free food and dental services were sort of organised by these groups who weren't part of the state. They weren't part of, no one was necessarily paying them, but they organised themselves and get these networks of aid to help struggling communities in America. Okay, he also said that they educate the masses, and then revolution can happen. Although he is a collectivist, he admitted that revolution could be bloody. So both him and Bakunin, although Bakunin said you shouldn't try and capture the state, did advocate revolution. And his vision was utopian. Which meant is a new, as yet unseen future would foster altruistic tendencies, and he said this leap in thinking and in society was necessary. So he admits himself that he was a utopian, but he thinks it's a good idea. How are we going to use him? So he's the major thinker for anarcho-communism, I think. His concept of mutual aid sort of provides the intellectual foundations for anarcho-communism, and he admits that full revolution will probably be violent. So you can use him in any of those contexts, really. Okay, next one is anarcho-syndicalism. So this is probably one step towards the sort of centre, I suppose, of the scale. So trade unions and producer groups are the agents of change. So they are very active in organising society, producing goods, but also in the revolution itself. So actually, I've said that Bakunin was an anarcho-communist, but he's also has some of his writings went to influence anarcho-syndicalists as well. So in line with Bakunin's view of propaganda by the deeds, actions that subvert rather than try and capture the state, like strikes or boycotts, are supposed to be the way that you achieve anarcho-syndicalism. So trade unions would educate as well as build parallel institutions. So parallel institutions might be ways of distributing resources, or even I don't know, food, water, banking, whatever. The best example really is before the Civil War and the dictatorship of Franco. The basically parts of Spain were run on these grounds. So trade unions of bakers and teachers and telecoms workers and whatever would basically organise society in places like Barcelona in the 1930s. And you can see there's a nice bit of anarchist propaganda there, which translates as the final blow must be struck, and that's the worker you can see stamping on the neck of the fascist monster there. There's not really, I mean, Bakunin's thought influenced syndicalism. There's not really a direct thinker for syndicalism, but Bakunin certainly thought certainly influenced them. So that's why I put his slide there, but same slide. Okay, mutualism. Mutualism is kind of the bridge between collectivist and individualist anarchists. So it comes out of Prudog's critique of large-scale property ownership as theft. So what he was arguing there is he's basically said property that you can make money off without working is a form of theft, and it's negative in society. So the Occupy movement, We Are the 99%, has its roots in mutualism. Prudog argues for the right to possessions, the right to use land and tools, etc. And economies work by individuals and small groups exchanging goods and services using labour notes. So that's generally what mutualism is. Let's go a little bit more into. So Prudog was around a similar kind of time actually to Bakunin, and they both met and they talked, and don't know if they're friends or not, but they definitely exchanged ideas. In his book, What is Property, he wrote, so he objected to large-scale property ownership. So that that could provide an income without work for its owners. So strangely, quite a lot of us dream of is, owning 5 houses and letting other people work for our money. Prudog actually looked at that and said, actually, that's not moral, it's not good, and if it happens on too large a scale, then you get mass exploitation. And he would have extended that to banks as well. So he would have said the lending of money for interest is wrong. And so he advocated mutualism. So workers retain control over production, but also over the fruits of their labour. So I've given an example here. There's a Mondragon cooperative. So it's actually one of Spain's current largest companies. It's got a turnover of over 10 million euros. But the wage differentials within the companies do never go over a ratio of 1 to 6. So that means the lowest paid worker in Mondragon is only ever, well, the highest paid worker, in Mondragon only ever earns 6 times as much as the lowest paid worker. And if you could compare that to a FTSE 100 company in this country, that ratio would be 1,000 to 1, or several hundred to 1 anyway. So it's a lot fairer, and still very productive. So he was worried about the individual being over, as well as being concerned about private property. He was worried about the individual being overwhelmed by the group. So advocated the right to possession. So individuals as well, for him, could have held on to possession of tools, possession of their home, possession of the fruits of their labour, and then they could trade it using these labour notes. Okay, for him, now this is quite interesting because he's the first sort of bridge over, and he said evolution, not revolution, would happen. So he thinks slowly we would transfer to this society through parallel institutions. So as you start, let's imagine that you make a cooperative and workers start controlling and producing for a particular company or whatever, and slowly that, because it's more efficient and because it's not making profits for individuals, it becomes the best, and it slowly overtakes other companies, for instance, or a bank that overtakes a people's bank or something like that. So he says it will happen slowly, not necessarily a revolution. So how to use? Well, he's a great link between the collectivist and the individualist because he kind of supports both. He's a major thinker for mutualism. Obviously, it's kind of his idea, and he thought radical change would come gradually through evolution. So another interesting thing. Okay, so let's start on the individualists. These are anarcho-capitalists. Now, I've put a little picture here on the right. You may wonder what this is of. This is of a gated community, and maybe this is a little bit like what anarcho-capitalists imagined. So they reject government because it forces taxation. They believe that government involvement of the free market is distorting and inefficient. So public goods such as roads, hospitals, schools, security, justice could all be provided by the market through contracts freely entered into. So a little bit like our gated community on the right. You might pay for a house and then pay for people to come around and patrol outside your house, providing you with security. There might be a school within your gated community which you also pay for, and you have a nice little gated life. All right. So as people are critical of the sort of communities on our right here, critics also argue that this is not true anarchism. It ignores inequality and it only provides freedom for the very rich. So it's to be clear, lots of the anarchists on the other side, and maybe even egoists as well, would probably agree with each other on lots of things, but they would disagree with anarcho-capitalists. There's no spec thinker for anarcho-capitalists, but Benjamin Tucker is a name. He's an American thinker, and he believed most of the above. So you can, if you really want to put a name in there, you can put that name in. Okay. Okay. So the last one is an individualist anarchist branch as well, called Egoism. And the reason I put a little ghosty here is because Max Stirner often talked about the spook. So he was trying to always get this idea of what an ego is, what an individual is at all, and he said it's like kind of like the ghost in the machine. Anyway, I haven't got time to go into that now. individuals, egoists, I believe that individuals' only interest should be themselves. They should concentrate on themselves and their own true nature, and fulfilling their sort of potential, as it were. It argues that the state routinely limits the individual through its authority, and that must therefore be abolished. So they are, but more than that, Max Stirner and other egoists argue that any system that limits the ego or individuals should be abolished. So this could include religions, morality, sexual code, and sexual codes. So not just the state. Anything that limits the individual should be we should look twice at. In a sense, it rejects most understanding of society as we currently understand it. So it's proposed by Stirner, who argued that this would not look like Hobbes' states in nature, but like a union of free souls, and what he called the union of egoists. Okay, so let's have a little look at Max Stirner. So in his book, The Ego and His Own, he wrote, the individual must be placed above all else and should not be controlled. Any authority, structure, or system which limits their freedom is by definition negative. So he argues that even morality should not necessarily be obeyed. He also criticised much work. So he was a bit vague on this, but he criticised many jobs that the capitalist system produced. People who would interact with through a union of egos, but would all do. People would interact through a union of egoists, but all would be done for the good of the individual and not the common good. So no one would be forced into any kind of contract or relationship or anything. It would all be done by individuals making free voluntary choices. This union of egoists. Okay. So how to use? Well, he's the founder of Individualist and massively radical in his thinking. He criticises capitalism, but would utterly reject collectivism. He would achieve change not through revolution, but through insurrection and individual change, basically. So the interesting thing about Max Stirner is that he would ask you, maybe approach like, what is you? Okay, so he's in a way he's actually quite philosophical. We don't go into it so much in politics, but he says, what makes up you? Is it can you really name things which are not a product of your religion, your parents, your education? What is it? And he was really trying to get at the core of the individual and get the individual to really engage with themselves, I suppose, and to in this way sort of become who they truly are. I think this is what he was getting at, and he thinks that if you remove all control, people will sort of flourish in a way they haven't before. I think that's what he's getting at. Okay, so listen, Emma Goldman, I've tagged her on to the end. She's a very famous anarchist, a very famous thinker, and very eloquent. She wrote lots of books, but it's hard to place her exactly in any of the anarchist branches. Why? Well, she kind of argued for positive human nature and social harmony. So she was a bit of a cross between individualist and collectivist anarchists. She totally opposed the state and violence, and she argued that nationalism and patriotism are evils that encourage militarism. That means the build-up of armies and the use of armies around the world. Okay, so that's something to think about for the modern day, really. I mean, we're seeing a rise of nationalism, and all these different countries beating the drum, saying that we're the best. And she said actually that's a really negative thing, and it's a really negative way that people associate. Okay, and behind that was the state that encourages violence and is thereby deceit. Okay, so she's very famous for rejecting the parliamentary route to genuine change, and she's got that lovely quote: "If voting changed anything, they would make it illegal," which is sort of quite funny as well, I think. She argued that the struggle of the suffragettes was misguided, because as once in power, they would be corrupted like everything else. So how do we use her? Well, she's a good bridge between the two strands. She's most useful for arguing that the state is based on deceit and violence, and also that it's corrupting. So if you're trying to explain why the state is bad for anarchists, she's a really good example of that. She's saying, look, it doesn't matter if women sit in parliament, because actually Once they're sat in Parliament, they'll be corrupted just like the men who sit in Parliament are. And that's a good example for that. And sorry, gone too far. Okay. So if you'll notice here, seems to be, and this is why I think they might ask a question on it, there seems to be a bit of a divide between the collectivists and the individualists when it comes to whether they advocate a revolution, whether it be a violent one or not. So there seems to be, it's a question that might come up, hasn't come up yet, and it's maybe worth knowing a quick plan. Okay, quick afterthought before we go. When it comes to differences, particularly with the economy, anarcho-capitalism, capitalists really stand out as different because they're not cut really from the same cloth as the others, as they have no notion of equality. All right, so anarcho-capitalism don't really care about private property. They don't really care about inequality. That withstanding, they are all anarchists are united. It's important to remember this. All anarchists are united in a rather radical call for freedom that you don't find in other ideologies. So they're kind of unique, and that binds them. But then I think particularly the anarcho-capitalists are so different that it's almost to be not part of the same ideology at all when it comes to particularly questions of equality in the economy. Okay, guys, good luck. That's it.